I don't feel the push so much as the deck vanish under my heels, the rail a cold flash at my ribs, and my sister's citrus perfume, the last warm thing before the water clamps my chest. An hour earlier, the captain called me Mrs. Maddox and Sloane answered for me, while the photo she posted later cropped me to the edge. A neat little trick too many women recognize, praised, and erased in the same breath. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Avery Hale, and the night I sold my company for $1.1 billion, my name was missing from the program, printed on thick cream paper that smelled faintly of ink and citrus polish, the kind they use to make rented ballrooms gleam. The master of ceremonies lifted his glass and thanked my husband for his vision. My sister slid into the center chair because the camera line was cleaner there. And a stranger in a black vest leaned in to whisper congratulations, Miss Hale, as if he knew he was rescuing something small that had been left under the table. The room warmed to Sloane's laughter the way summer air warms to the sound of sprinklers. Pretty and harmless. Everyone convinced the garden knows who watered it. And when they called for a photo, my sister tugged me left so the lighting would hit her shoulders just right, while Cole did the pleasant, practiced shrug I had seen in boardrooms, the one that said let the experts handle it. As the photographer waved his hand and cropped me to the edge, a glossy rectangle destined for a headline that would call my husband a visionary and my sister the face of a new foundation. Cole carried the speech the way he carried every room, cufflinks catching the chandeliers, baritone steady as he told the story of our team and our perseverance and our promise to the coast. Words that landed soft as sea foam and hid what mattered beneath them. When he introduced Blue Beacon, the ocean fund I had built on napkins and late nights and long walks with tide charts, he gestured to Sloane like a magician revealing velvet and asked the audience to welcome the new public face of the effort. And I heard the click of 100 phones, while my place card sat a seat away with the wrong name printed in a bold serif font that pretended accuracy. In the morning, the hotel delivered a stack of papers and a tin of coffee to our suite. And there on a business page was my company's name, above a photograph that framed Cole in clean light and caught only the angle of my shoulder. A caption that called him chief architect and credited Sloane for community vision. And it would have been almost funny if it hadn't been familiar. My phone buzzed with congratulations from people I did not know well. And my mother's text said, "So proud of all three of you. The all doing more work than anyone admitted." Back at the glass house on the cliff, the smart speakers chimed good evening, Mrs. Maddox, as if walls could take sides. Sloane breezed in with armfuls of lilies and new stories about people who had always secretly believed in me, placing a vase in a way that blocked the view of the framed patent that had once felt too large for my office. And Cole kissed my temple and told me to let him handle the boring parts now. Taxes and trusts and the delicate machinery of wealth that he described as if it were a sleeping child. I did not argue because, in a house that prized ease above accuracy, arguing would have made me the problem. I opened a bottle of wine we had carried home from a small coastal town where the wind tasted like rosemary, and listened to plans for a thank you cruise, and a quiet night on the water under bioluminescence, where the sea draws constellations under your feet. While my name kept slipping off surfaces, the way sunscreen slides from damp shoulders, not neglected intentionally at first, just not held. The first seam gave in my office when I stepped out to make tea and came back to find a reflection in the glass that did not belong to any framed certificate. My sister's hand on my husband's shoulder, in a way that could still be explained as comfort if you refused to see the rest. His head bent, her laugh caught inside his throat. The kind of moment that leaves a small coin of cold in your stomach and waits for you to recognize its currency. The next morning, I asked to see my lawyer in a way that made him clear his afternoon. Jonah slid a yellow legal pad across his desk, while I told him I wanted to make sure Blue Beacon could not be turned into a talking point, and that, in the event anything happened to me. Money moved where it was promised without pause or performance. A line wide enough to carry weight when I was not there to lift it. He did not ask me why my hands shook. And we drafted a sealed codicil that would activate transfers to the endowment if I could not be reached for 2 days. A failsafe trigger written in careful strokes that did not rely on anyone's grief to behave. I hired Ben Ortiz to look where I could not, and he took the assignment the way good carpenters take a rotten board, tapping lightly and listening for hollow spaces. His report, delivered in a manila folder that smelled faintly of toner, was a story smooth for public consumption until you pressed your thumb into it. Failed funds that never became charges. Investors who walked away convinced they had simply been unlucky. A talent for finding holes in other people's boats and calling it rescue when he patched them with his name. I asked Tessa to look at my network the way a falcon looks at a fence, not as a barrier, but as something to see through. And she found a voice file nested in a forgotten cache that should not have been there, a fragment barely a breath long. My husband's voice smoothing words until they almost slipped off each other. Open water erases. And my sister's reply with the little smile you hear even without a camera. We will swim pretty, a phrase so light it felt harmless until it wasn't. At home, the dishwasher hummed and the vents breathed in that steady way houses do when they are pretending not to listen. And I made a list on the back of a utility bill because paper felt less hackable than anything connected to the grid. The list had 7 items, and only 3 of them were about money. The rest were about ways of not being found until I wanted to be. A hair tie with a thin beacon tucked into its seam. Earrings with a dot of metal meant to tell someone who knows how to listen where the person wearing them has gone. A small account in a name that was mine, once removed. When Cole suggested the cruise, he said it the way someone offers a bandage, and I accepted it the way someone accepts a ride they would rather not refuse. Because sometimes you gather what you need by stepping into the place where you would rather not stand. Sloane offered to take photos and adjust the straps of everything I wore because she had an eye for lines and angles, and the easy authority of someone who has been told her entire life that she knows what looks good. We boarded on a Friday afternoon when the water lay flat under a sky the color of unpainted glass, and the crew moved with the relaxed competence of people who anticipate storms that have not decided whether to arrive. The captain tipped his cap and called me Mrs. Maddox and I said Miss. Hail out of habit, but the wind that carried us out also carried my correction away. And Sloane stepped into that empty space to answer for me with a thank you and a wink about the sunset we would not miss. We ate grilled fish that tasted like salt and smoke and lemon, and I excused myself to the deck where the air moved more honestly. Cole followed with a patch between 2 fingers and a gentle explanation about how the ocean does strange things to equilibrium. How this would help. A slap of adhesive behind my ear, where skin is thin and capillaries close to the surface, and I let him press it in place and counted to 10 while the lights along the shore became fewer, then smaller, then gone. When the sun dropped and the sea began to make its own light, a blue that blooms when movement disturbs dark water. Sloane took my hand and led me to the bow for a picture that would look like we had been painted into a fairy tale, where science and magic hold hands. She lifted her arms around my ribs, as if adjusting fabric that did not need adjusting, while Cole's footsteps came up behind us with a sound that belonged to shoes built for land. And I breathed in her citrus perfume, and then the deck moved hard and sudden, and the rail caught my side like a question I did not know I had asked. The cold erased the beginning of my scream, and the weight of the ocean grabbed my chest the way a hand grabs a throat, steady and unforgiving. For a few startled seconds, all I could hear was my own heart arguing for more oxygen than the world would give it. And I forced the cadence I have used since swim team, the count that smooths panic into work, 4 short breaths, 2 longer, arms pulling water that pushed back and then gave, legs kicking not for speed but for endurance, the way you swim when distance is not negotiable. Bioluminescence burst around me like bruised neon every time my hands cut through. The evidence of my body and outline the sea could not help but draw. I rolled to my back to sip air without swallowing salt, and listened for a sound I remembered from a map, the bell on a research buoy that rings when the right wind lifts it. A small sound made large by how badly you need it. The patch behind my ear pulsed a sick little heat, and my head went cotton soft around the edges. So I dug my nails beneath it and peeled it away and watched it vanish into the black. A tiny piece of trash I promised the ocean I would repay. The boat had stopped being a shape and become only an engine note and then only a memory. And the bell rang somewhere to my left, small and insistent, a metronome for vertebrates that do not plan on vanishing. I reached the buoy hand over wet hand and wrapped my arm through the metal, the way you wrap an arm through a friend in a crowd when you do not want to lose each other. I clicked the bead tucked inside my hair tie, a double pulse that told a small part of the world I am here without telling anyone who wanted me gone. And the minutes spun slow until the skiff appeared, a university research boat with chipped blue paint and a graduate student at the tiller, his palm full of rope and his face open with surprise rather than fear. They pulled me in with the practical kindness of people trained to handle fragile things, without making a speech about fragility. When they checked my earring in the cabin light, the tiny metal dot blinked and the technician looked up and said my name, like a question and then like a certainty. And I shook my head because recognition is a kind of exposure. And I signed a generic intake under a borrowed name and promised to report later. And they did what decent people do when a stranger asks for as little as possible and still more than is comfortable. On the Mexican side, the dockboards were warm under my feet, and the harbor crowded in that generous way small working places crowd. Ropes and voices and gulls and the constant negotiation of space. In a bathroom mirror that did me no favors, I cut my hair with a knife borrowed from a man selling churros. A clean line that did not feel like loss so much as a clear seam. And I bought a shirt from a market stall and wore my own jeans and practiced a new name under my breath until it stuck. I found an internet cafe where an old love song played through a tinny speaker and logged into the emergency channel Maya and I had set up. And the screen filled with her words, fear and relief again. Ben kept a ledger of what Cole and Sloan were doing because people who almost get away with something keep doing it until it feels like walking. And he sent photographs of new cars and a necklace and a down payment on a mountain property. Men in suits shaking hands with my husband in rooms my signature had paid for. The picture of a widower whose grief looked good on camera. Tessa dug under the deleted layers and found threads most people assume are gone when they empty a trash folder. Messages in which my marriage had been scheduled and my death rehearsed. Jokes layered over contempt. Phrases for a press conference that would break hearts for an hour and open a floodgate of approval for the way they were holding up. Jonah filed a motion for a temporary restraining order on assets. The kind of paper that carries the specific anger of a professional who has warned a client about a fire hazard only to be shown an open flame and a curtain. I slept 3 hours at a time in a small hotel with a stubborn fan and a clean floor, waking to the sound of mopeds and boats and a woman laughing on the street below. In the mornings, I wrote instructions in simple language for people who might need what I had needed, not because the world would read it, but because language is a kind of scaffolding when the building shifts. And by the end of the week, Maya had a team of contractors inside my house, laying cable through the bones at the request of an insurance company that existed only on paper. The installers left me an offline admin key because I had asked for it months ago during an upgrade, and no one had remembered to collect it. That small oversight was the space I needed to step into the house without asking permission. And on a Thursday, a few hours before midnight, with the tide sending up that bright fish smell that means morning is on its way, I slipped through the service entrance Cole never bothered to reset. And the smart speaker tried to greet the wrong person until I told it my name and fed it the key and watched the light go green. In the foyer, I set a single pedestal because pedestals do exactly the job you expect when the right object sits on top. I placed a life jacket there, monogram stitched onto bright fabric in looping letters that had once branded linens and social media posts. And inside the pocket, I tucked a small drive with messages and bank logs and a short audio that would play when fingers pried at the zipper. a gentle proof no one needed to shout to understand. They came home bright with time zones and attention, the kind of intoxication people bring to private rooms after public performances, and paused at the threshold because music was playing in the living room. A jazz record Cole liked because it was complicated without asking him to work. They moved carefully through the house, deciding whether they were alone. A performance they had rehearsed in smaller ways for years without ever calling it rehearsal. They saw the life jacket and stopped inside the first second, as if someone had set a piece of our past on the table and told them to explain it. I stepped out of the shadow by the glass wall that faces the ocean and said hello in the voice I save for people I am done explaining myself to. And Sloane made a small animal sound and looked to Cole the way someone looks at a lifeguard they hired from a brochure. While he did the calculation you can see in certain men, inventorying exits and stories and whether a door is closer than a confession. I did not offer an explanation because the house had one ready. When he unzipped the pocket of the life jacket, the recorder inside woke and played his whisper in an intimate surround. Open water erases, followed by my sister's light reply, "We will swim pretty." A phrase that did not sound harmless anymore in a room that remembered its owner. I pressed a button that sent a signal down the street, and a gate rolled open with the soft obedience of machines that do not care who pays the power bill. Colt moved the way he always moves when he thinks a thing can be fixed with speed, dragging an end table across the floor with a clatter and lunging for a side door. Two members of my security team stepped from the hallway and took the knife out of his hand, the way you take a toy from a dog who does not know it will choke. And Sloane slid down the wall and began to speak in confession fragments, better suited to a different audience. Words about manipulation and love and a lifelong shadow. Detectives from the county and two federal agents came in with calm, municipal faces. They served a search warrant and a copy of the court order freezing certain accounts pending a hearing, seized phones under the warrant, and handed Cole and Sloan notices to surrender their passports at arraignment. Paperwork that lined up like fence posts along a road, so no one could pretend it wasn't a road. Jonas stood to the side with a file and the steady look of a man whose warnings have finally found air. I did not speak to them because silence was the only sentence I had not heard yet. I signed the inventory receipt for the items law enforcement collected and watched the agents carry out small, expensive devices that had once been our toys. And when the door closed behind them, the jazz faded to a quiet fuss, the kind music makes when it knows it has outstayed its welcome. I slept in a hotel with the curtains open because the darkness over the bay did not feel like something trying to swallow me. And in the morning, Jonah and I walked into a courthouse painted the tired off-white all municipal buildings share. The judge did what judges do when there are messages and a planned trip to a country without extradition and a life jacket that has become a witness, spoke about risk in community and the next date on the calendar, and set conditions that sounded like a door closing with a gentle but final click. Afterward, I went back to the Cliff House only long enough to pack a few things that were mine, even if they did not look like much. And then I left for good, because rooms can hold versions of you the way jars hold beach glass. Pretty and smooth, but no longer sharp enough to cut cable. Across the bridge, I rented a place with clean lines and good locks, and a view of water that did not try to own me. And on the bluff behind the old house, I twisted off my ring and let the ocean keep it. A circle for a circle. A transaction that did not require witnesses. The press wanted me to talk, and the shows wanted me to cry in a way that would cut well into segments between advertisements. I said yes to one reporter who listens more than she speaks, answered what I wanted to and nothing I did not, said that people who underestimated me had never met the parts of me that swim in the dark. And then I closed the door on that part of the story, because healing is not content. I put my back into Blue Beacon and built it around practical help for people whose lives have been run quietly into ditches by those who called it love, legal support without lectures, small grants that arrive before the worst part, a handbook written in plain language about bank accounts and spare keys, and how clever people hide control in forms you sign because you are tired. We hired counselors who understood what it means to be erased in your own house. And we partnered with shelters that know money is as much a lock as a door. Months turned and court turned and sentences came. Years with numbers that mean one thing when you are young and another when you are middle-aged. I went because closure sometimes needs a calendar. And when the deputy touched Sloane's elbow to turn her toward the door, she looked back with the face she wore when a dog ran into the street when we were kids. And I did not move because there are silences that answer better than any sentence. On a winter morning, when the light stayed low over the water like a hand that has not decided whether to touch, I visited the prison and sat across from Sloane in a room that smelled like disinfectant and coffee. She said things shaped like apologies without the architecture to hold a load. And I told her I did not hate her, because hatred is a tether, and I was done being tied, that I did not belong to her anymore. And I stood because some points are made better on your feet. I wrote a small book that reads like a ledger for survivors who prefer lists to lament, and started writing checks to businesses run by women who pitch with the kind of steadiness that frightens shallow men. In my kitchen, where nothing hangs except what has been earned, I pinned a photograph of a waiter in a black vest in a hotel ballroom. The man who said my name correctly and handed me a glass of water that tasted like metal in relief, a small memorial to accuracy. On the anniversary of the night, the sea tried to make a story out of me. I chartered a small boat without a name on its hull, and went out to where the water remembers even after people pretend not to. I dropped white roses one by one, because rituals are ways of making time visible, and kept one to press between the pages of a manual for small engines, because there is comfort in keeping something soft inside a book about hard things. And the ocean moved like a chest breathing in and out, while the sun laid a path to a horizon that looked like an answer I had already given. At home, I called Maya and Tessa and Ben and Jonah by their first names because they are not roles. They are people who stood up when other people sat down. I cooked pasta with more garlic than anyone needed, and ate half of it over the sink, because some nights do not require plates. And later, I stood by the window, while fog braided itself between the towers, and I said my name out loud, once for who I had been, and once for who I am. And the house did not answer because I had not said it too. And I like that more than I can say.